The supply ship was sinking. In the freezing waters of the Pacific, 183 Japanese women prisoners watched from the deck of the USS Maritime as their only source of food, medicine, and warm clothing disappeared beneath the waves. Winter was coming. The camp had barely enough supplies for 2 weeks. The American commander had a choice: order an emergency supply run that would take 3 weeks, or use the available transport to evacuate the Japanese prisoners to a warmer, better-equipped facility 800 miles south. Every officer in the room knew what logic dictated. Prisoners could wait. Soldiers needed supplies. The war had taught them that resources went to your own people first. That's how survival worked. That's how every army in history had operated. But Commander James Mitchell looked at the manifest in his hands, then at the weather reports predicting the worst winter California had seen in 50 years, and said 5 words that would change everything. Get the women out first. The room went silent. His second-in-command, Captain Reynolds, spoke carefully. Sir, if we use the transport for prisoner evacuation, we won't have supplies for 3 weeks. The men will be on half rations. We'll run out of medical supplies in 10 days. Mitchell didn't hesitate. I'm aware, Captain. Get the women out first. That's an order. What happened next would shock the Japanese women more than any battle they had witnessed. It would force them to confront a truth more devastating than any defeat, that the enemy valued their lives more than their own country ever had. And in that truth, everything they believed would crumble. If you want to hear more incredible true stories from history that challenge everything you think you know, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. These are the stories they don't teach in textbooks, and you won't want to miss them. Before we dive into this remarkable true story, do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. History is full of moments that reveal the best and worst of humanity, and this channel brings you the stories that matter. Now let's get into what happened when 183 Japanese women discovered that American commanders would sacrifice their own comfort to ensure enemy prisoners survived the winter. October 15th, 1945. The war had been over for exactly 2 months. Camp Stockton, a prisoner of war facility 60 miles east of San Francisco, housed 183 Japanese women who had surrendered in the final weeks of the Pacific Campaign. Most were young, between 18 and 35. They had served as nurses, clerks, radio operators, and translators across the Pacific Theater. The morning started normally. The women woke at 6:30 to the sound of the bell, dressed in their standard gray prison uniforms, and made their beds with military precision. They filed into the mess hall for breakfast: oatmeal with raisins, toast with butter, coffee, and milk. After 2 months in American custody, they had stopped being surprised by the abundance of food. They had stopped feeling guilty about eating it too, though that was a lie they told themselves. The guilt never really went away. Keiko, a 24-year-old former nurse from Nagasaki, sat with her usual group near the windows. She liked watching the sunrise over the California hills. It reminded her of home, though she tried not to think about home too much. The letters from her family described a city that no longer existed, a landscape of ash and radiation where nothing grew and people died slowly from invisible poison. The supply ship should arrive today, said Hana, a radio operator who had picked up enough English to eavesdrop on the guards' conversations. I heard the Americans talking about it yesterday. They're excited about the winter coats and the medical supplies. The camp had been preparing for winter for weeks. The buildings were old and the insulation was poor. The American officers had ordered extra blankets, warm coats, and a shipment of coal to keep the stoves running through the cold months. The women had been told they would receive proper winter clothing. After experiencing the warmth of American generosity for 2 months, they had started to believe such promises were actually kept. At 9:15 that morning, a jeep roared into the camp at high speed, kicking up dust. The women working in the laundry looked up, startled. The driver jumped out and ran toward the administration building without his usual casual pace. Even from a distance, they could see something was wrong. Within minutes, whistles began blowing. Guards appeared, their faces serious, calling out orders. The women were instructed to return to their barracks immediately and wait for further instructions. This was unusual. In 2 months, there had never been an emergency assembly. The women moved quickly, quietly, their old military training taking over. When your captors start running and shouting, you obey without question. Inside Barracks 3, Keiko and her group sat on their beds, waiting. The room was silent except for the sound of wind rattling the windows. Through the thin walls they could hear guards running past, officers shouting commands, vehicles starting and driving away. "What's happening?" whispered Yuki, a young clerk who still flinched every time someone raised their voice. "Are they sending us back to Japan?" "Maybe there's been an attack," suggested Hana. "Maybe the war isn't really over." Keiko shook her head. "The war is over. Japan surrendered. The Emperor himself said so on the radio. Then why all the panic?" They didn't have to wait long for an answer. At 10 o'clock, the translator, a Japanese-American sergeant named Tanaka, entered their barracks with Commander Mitchell and Captain Reynolds. The women stood immediately, bowing slightly, a habit none of them could break even though the Americans had told them repeatedly it wasn't necessary. Commander Mitchell looked tired. He was a tall man in his late 40s with gray hair and the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd seen too much war. He'd been fair to the prisoners since their arrival, ensuring they had adequate food, medical care, and basic comforts. Some of the women had started to trust him, though trust was a complicated thing when your truster wore the uniform of your enemy. Sergeant Tanaka translated as the commander spoke. "Ladies, I need to inform you of a situation. This morning at approximately 7:30, the SS Pacific Merchant, which was carrying supplies for this camp, encountered engine failure 60 miles off the coast. The ship has sunk. All crew members were rescued, but the cargo is lost." A murmur rippled through the barracks. Lost cargo meant lost supplies. Lost supplies meant they would go back to rationing, to hunger, to cold. The taste of abundance had been brief. Now it was over. But Mitchell wasn't finished. The cargo included winter clothing, medical supplies, food stores, and coal for heating. We have enough current supplies to last approximately 2 weeks at full rations. Winter is coming earlier than expected this year. Weather reports indicate we may see the coldest season California has experienced in half a century. He paused, letting Tanaka translate. The women's faces showed confusion. Why was he telling them this? Prisoners weren't usually informed about supply problems. This felt wrong, like he was preparing them for something worse. "The nearest supply depot is in San Diego, approximately 800 miles south," Mitchell continued. "I've been in contact with headquarters. They can have an emergency shipment ready, but it will take 3 weeks to process and transport. 3 weeks in which this camp will be on reduced rations and limited heating." The women understood now. They were being told they would suffer. They were being prepared for hardship. This made sense. This was normal. Prisoners were always the first to feel the shortage, the first to go hungry, the first to freeze. But then Mitchell said something that made no sense at all. "However, there is an alternative solution. The USS Maritime, currently docked in San Francisco, has space available for transport. I have authorization to evacuate all prisoners to Camp Pendleton in San Diego. The facility there is newer, better insulated, and fully supplied. The transfer would take 48 hours. You would be warm, fed, and safe while we work on resupplying this camp." Silence. Complete silence. The women stared at him, trying to understand what he was saying. Hana spoke up, her English halting but clear. "Sir, if we go what about American soldiers here? Who gets cold?" Mitchell looked at her directly. "If we use the Maritime for prisoner evacuation, we cannot use it for emergency supplies. My men will remain here on reduced rations and limited heating until the supply shipment arrives in 3 weeks. It will be uncomfortable, but you will be safe." The women looked at each other, stunned. This had to be a trick. There had to be something they weren't understanding. Enemy commanders did not sacrifice the comfort of their own soldiers for prisoners. That wasn't how war worked. That wasn't how anything worked. Keiko raised her hand slowly, a gesture left over from school days. "Commander Mitchell, sir. Why would you do this? We are prisoners. We are your enemy. Your men should come first." Mitchell was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was firm but not unkind. "You're not our enemy anymore, ma'am. The war is over. You're under our protection now. That means we're responsible for your safety and welfare. If I keep you here and you freeze, or someone gets sick because we don't have medicine, that's on me. I won't let that happen when I have the ability to prevent it." He looked around the room at all the confused, disbelieving faces. "You'll leave tomorrow morning at 0600 hours. Pack your personal belongings. You'll be back here in approximately a month once we've resupplied and made necessary improvements to the heating systems. Any questions?" No one spoke. What questions could they possibly ask? How do you ask why someone is choosing to be kind when everything in your experience has taught you that kindness is a weakness, a trap, or a lie? Mitchell nodded. "Sergeant Tanaka will provide more details this afternoon, that's all." He left. The officers left. The door closed. And in the barracks, 183 women sat in stunned silence, trying to process what they had just been told. The moment the door closed, the barracks exploded with noise. Women talking over each other, voices rising in confusion, fear, and disbelief. "It's a trick," said Fumiko, one of the older women who had served as a translator in Manila. She was in her early 30s, hardened by years of war, and deeply suspicious of any American kindness. "They're moving us somewhere worse. This Camp Pendleton is probably a punishment facility." "Why would they lie about it?" asked Hana. "They could just punish us without explanation. They don't need our permission." "It's psychological warfare," Fumiko insisted. "They make us think they're kind, and then they betray us. It makes the betrayal more devastating. The Americans are experts at this." But Keiko wasn't convinced. She'd worked in the camp hospital for 2 months, alongside American nurses and doctors. She'd seen how they treated patients, both American and Japanese. She'd watched a doctor spend 2 hours trying to save a Japanese prisoner who had pneumonia, using expensive medicine without hesitation, treating the woman as if she were his own citizen. I don't think it's a trick, Keiko said quietly. I think I think they're telling the truth. That's even worse, said a young woman named Sachiko. She was only 19, had been a clerk in Okinawa, and her worldview was still forming, still soft enough to be reshaped by evidence. If they're telling the truth, that means they value our lives more than their own comfort. What does that say about us? What does that say about Japan? The question hung in the air, heavy and uncomfortable. Because that was the real issue, wasn't it? If the Americans truly were sacrificing for enemy prisoners, it meant everything they had been taught about loyalty, honor, and the natural order of things was wrong. Japan would never do this, Yuki whispered. If we were holding American prisoners and faced the same choice, we would let them freeze. We would feed our own soldiers first. That's proper. That's logical. Then why does it feel wrong? Sachiko asked. Why does their choice feel more honorable than ours would be? Fumiko stood up abruptly. Stop this. You're letting them brainwash you. The Americans are not noble saviors. They dropped atomic bombs on civilians. They burned our cities. They killed millions. Don't forget that just because they give you warm food and kind words. She was right, of course. The Americans had done terrible things, but they were also doing this. Both things were true. How could both things be true? The debate continued through lunch, through the afternoon, into the evening. Some women remained convinced it was a trick or a trap. Others believed the Americans were sincere but questioned what it meant. A few, like Keiko, had begun to accept that they were witnessing something fundamentally different from anything they had experienced in the Japanese military, a system that valued individual human life over collective efficiency. That night, Keiko lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Through the thin walls, she could hear American soldiers in the next building, laughing about something. They didn't sound like men preparing to sacrifice. They sounded normal, casual, unbothered. She thought about a conversation she'd had with Nurse Helen last week. They'd been folding bandages together, and Helen had mentioned that her brother was a POW in Germany. I think about him every day, Helen had said. I hope whoever's guarding him treats him the way we treat your girls here, because that's the world I want to live in, one where we remember that enemies are still human beings. At the time, Keiko had thought it was naive. Beautiful, but naive. Now she wondered if maybe she was the naive one. Maybe she had been taught to see cruelty as strength and kindness as weakness. Maybe the Americans understood something Japan had forgotten. Or maybe Fumiko was right, and this was all an elaborate manipulation. Tomorrow they would find out. The next morning arrived cold and gray. The women packed their few belongings into small bags, spare clothing, personal letters, a few books from the camp library. Most had almost nothing. Prison had a way of reducing your life to essentials. At 5:30, the camp was already bustling. Soldiers loaded supplies onto trucks, organized paperwork, prepared the convoy. The women gathered in the yard, standing in loose groups, watching the Americans work. Everything was efficient, organized, purposeful. The military machine in motion. Commander Mitchell appeared, dressed in his heavy coat, carrying a clipboard. He moved through the groups of women, checking names against his list, ensuring everyone was accounted for. Captain Reynolds stood nearby, coordinating with the transport officers. Keiko noticed something interesting. The American soldiers helping with the evacuation weren't resentful. They weren't angry or bitter about being left behind on reduced rations. Most of them were joking around, some playfully complaining about having to eat bachelor stew for 3 weeks, but there was no real animosity. One young soldier even told her, through gestures and broken sentences, that he hoped the new camp had better weather for them. Why weren't they angry? Why weren't they demanding their officers prioritize American needs over Japanese prisoners? It made no sense. The convoy consisted of 4 large transport trucks and 2 jeeps. The women climbed aboard, squeezing onto wooden benches that ran along the sides of the truck beds. Canvas covers protected them from the wind. It wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't cruel either. It was practical, efficient transport. As the trucks prepared to depart, Commander Mitchell stood by the lead vehicle. Sergeant Tanaka translated his final words. Safe travels, ladies. The officers at Camp Pendleton have been informed of your arrival. You'll be well cared for. When you return here in a month, we'll have this place properly winterized. Until then, stay warm. The trucks rumbled to life. As they pulled out of the camp gates, Keiko looked back at the buildings they were leaving behind. She saw American soldiers standing in the yard watching them go. Some waved, a few even smiled. They were sacrificing for enemies who had fought against them, killed their friends, attacked their country. And they were doing it without hesitation, without expectation of gratitude, without making a show of their nobility. Keiko felt something crack inside her. Not break, crack, like ice beginning to thaw after a long winter. The drive to San Francisco took 3 hours through winding mountain roads and golden California hills. The women were quiet, lost in their own thoughts. Through gaps in the canvas, they watched America pass by. Small towns with neat houses, farms with fat cattle, stores with full windows. Everything untouched by war. Everything whole. In Japan, there was only rubble and ash. Here, life continued as if war were. Something that happened far away, in another world, to other people. The contrast was devastating. When they reached the San Francisco docks, the USS Maritime was waiting. It was a naval transport vessel, utilitarian and gray, but massive. As the women climbed the gangway, sailors stood at attention, saluting not mockingly, but formally, as if the prisoners were dignitaries deserving respect. A Navy lieutenant greeted them on deck. He was young, maybe 25, with red hair and freckles that made him look even younger. "Welcome aboard, ladies," he said through the translator. "The journey to San Diego will take approximately 18 hours. We'll be traveling through the night. You'll be assigned berthing below deck. Meals will be served at 0800, 1300, and 1800 hours. If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask the crew." Below deck, they were shown to a large berthing area with rows of bunks. It wasn't fancy, just metal frame beds with thin mattresses, but it was clean. Blankets were folded at the foot of each bed. Small lockers provided storage. The space smelled of metal and salt and diesel fuel, the particular scent of naval vessels everywhere. As the ship pulled away from the dock, some women went above to watch the shore recede. Keiko stood at the rail looking back at San Francisco Bay and the Golden Gate Bridge. 2 months ago, she had arrived here expecting torture and death. Now she was leaving on a ship commanded by former enemies who had chosen her safety over their own comfort. Nothing made sense anymore. Or maybe, terrifyingly, it was starting to make perfect sense, and that was what frightened her most. The USS Maritime cut through the Pacific swells with steady purpose. As the California coast slipped past to starboard, the 183 Japanese women tried to make sense of their temporary home. Life aboard a naval vessel was different from camp life. Everything was tighter, more compact, more efficient. The Americans ran a disciplined ship, with watches changing every 4 hours, bells marking time, and sailors moving through narrow corridors with practiced ease. But what surprised the women most was how the crew treated them. Keiko was standing near the mess deck the first evening when a young sailor, barely 20 years old, approached her. He held out a mug of coffee. "Ma'am," he said, gesturing to the cup. "Coffee?" She hesitated, then took it with both hands, bowing slightly. "Thank you." The sailor smiled, nodded, and walked away. No ulterior motive, no expectation of anything in return. Just a young man offering coffee to someone he thought might want some. It happened again and again. Small gestures that meant nothing individually but accumulated into something significant. A sailor helping an older woman up a steep ladder. Another sharing his chocolate ration with a group of curious prisoners. A cook making sure there were vegetarian options for those who requested them. The Americans weren't performing these kindnesses for show. They weren't trying to impress anyone. They just did them naturally, the way you might hold a door for a stranger or help someone carrying heavy packages. It was ingrained behavior, automatic courtesy. Hana, whose English had improved dramatically, started talking to the sailors during meals. One evening she returned to the berthing area with a stunned expression. "I asked one of them why they're nice to us," she said to the group gathered around her bunk. "I asked why they don't hate us. You know what he said?" The women leaned in, curious. He said, "Why would I hate you? You didn't start the war. You're just people who got caught up in it, same as me." Then he said the war was started by old men who sent young people to die. He said he doesn't hate Japanese people. He hates war. Fumiko scoffed. "Propaganda. He's telling you what you want to hear." But Hana shook her head. "I don't think so. He wasn't trying to convince me of anything. He was just talking. He told me about his sister back home, how she wants to be a teacher. He asked about my family. He seemed genuinely interested." "Psychological tactics," Fumiko insisted. "They're trained to do this." But even Fumiko was running out of convincing arguments. The evidence was piling up against her worldview. Every meal that arrived on time, every blanket freely given, every casual conversation that treated them like humans rather than enemies. The ship's doctor, a middle-aged man named Commander Pearson, held daily sick call in the medical bay. Several women who had chronic conditions or needed medication made appointments. Keiko, with her nursing background, accompanied them as a translator. She watched as Dr. Pearson treated each woman with the same care he would give an American sailor. He asked detailed questions about symptoms, checked vital signs thoroughly, prescribed medicine without hesitation. When an older woman named Tomoko mentioned she had digestive problems, he spent 20 minutes explaining dietary changes that might help, drawing diagrams to make sure she understood. "Why do you care so much, Keiko asked him at one point, when they were alone in the medical bay. Her English was good enough for simple conversations. Dr. Pearson looked up from the clipboard he was writing on. "About what?" "About us. We are prisoners. Enemy prisoners. In Japan, we were taught that prisoners should be grateful just to be alive. But you treat us like we matter." The doctor set down his pen. "You're under my care. That means you matter. I took an oath to do no harm and to heal when I can. That oath doesn't have exceptions for nationality. But the war is over, he said firmly. And even if it wasn't, you're sick women, not soldiers. You deserve medical care regardless of what uniform you used to wear. He went back to his paperwork as if what he'd just said was the most obvious thing in the world. Maybe to him it was. On the second night aboard the Maritime, something unexpected happened. The seas had grown rough, and many of the women were experiencing seasickness. The ship's crew, accustomed to the motion, moved through the berthing area with ginger candy and crackers, old sailor remedies for nausea. A group of sailors ended up sitting with a group of prisoners, sharing their limited Japanese vocabulary and the women's limited English, creating a pidgin language of gestures, drawings, and patience. One sailor, a man in his 30s named Mike from somewhere called Iowa, pulled out photographs from his wallet. He showed the women pictures of his wife and 2 children, a boy and a girl, both under 5 years old. I haven't seen them in 2 years, he said slowly, pointing at the pictures. War. Long time. Miss them. The women understood. They all had people they missed. Sachiko showed him a creased photograph she carried everywhere, her parents and younger sister standing in front of their house in Kyoto, taken before the war when the world still made sense. Mike looked at the photo for a long time. Beautiful family, he said simply. He pointed to her sister. How old? 14, Sachiko replied. Now 16. Maybe. If alive. The words hung in the air. Mike nodded slowly, sadly. War is a terrible thing, he said. Kills too many. Hurts everyone. More photographs came out. More stories were shared through broken language and universal gestures. A sailor showed pictures of his destroyed hometown in Hawaii. He'd been stationed at Pearl Harbor. A prisoner showed a letter describing the firebombing of Tokyo. A cook shared that his brother had died at Guadalcanal. A woman quietly mentioned she'd been in Hiroshima's outskirts when the bomb fell. They were trading grief, not comparing who had suffered more, not arguing about who was right or wrong, just acknowledging that war had hurt everyone, that loss was loss regardless of which side you were on. At one point, Mike pulled out a harmonica and started playing. It was a sad, slow melody that needed no translation. Music transcended language. Several women began to cry quietly, but they didn't leave. They sat together in the dim berthing area, enemies 2 months ago, now just people who had survived something terrible and were trying to make sense of what came next. When the impromptu gathering finally broke up around midnight, something had shifted. The sailors didn't seem quite as foreign, the prisoners didn't seem quite as afraid. They were beginning to see each other, really see each other, as humans who had been caught up in something bigger than themselves. The next morning, Keiko was on deck watching the sunrise when Captain Reynolds approached. She had met him at Camp Stockton. He was Commander Mitchell's second-in-command, the one who had questioned the decision to evacuate prisoners before resupplying soldiers. Good morning, he said, standing beside her at the rail. You're up early. Couldn't sleep, she replied. Too much thinking. He nodded. I understand that feeling. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the sun turn the ocean gold and orange. Finally, Keiko spoke. Captain Reynolds, may I ask you something? Of course. When Commander Mitchell ordered our evacuation, you questioned it. I heard you. You said the American soldiers should come first. You said it wasn't logical to sacrifice for prisoners. She looked at him directly. Do you still believe that? Reynolds was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. Honestly, part of me still thinks it's impractical. We're going to be cold and hungry for 3 weeks because of this decision. My men are going to be uncomfortable. As an officer, my job is to take care of my soldiers. Then why did you obey the order? Because Mitchell was right, Reynolds said simply. My job is to take care of my soldiers, but it's also to uphold the values we're supposed to be fighting for. If we say we believe in human dignity and the rule of law, but then we treat prisoners like they're less important than supplies, what are we really fighting for? What separates us from the tyranny we just defeated? He turned to face her fully. The difference between us and the regimes we fought isn't just military power, it's philosophy. We say every human life has inherent value. If that's true, it has to be true even when it's inconvenient, especially when it's inconvenient. Otherwise, it's just propaganda. Keiko felt tears welling up. In Japan, we were taught that duty to the nation comes before everything. Before yourself, before your family, before strangers. We were taught that sacrifice for the collective is the highest virtue. And what do you think now? Reynolds asked gently. I think... She struggled to find the words. I think maybe there's virtue in valuing individuals, too. Maybe a nation that takes care of its most vulnerable, even when they're enemies, is stronger than one that only cares about its own. Reynolds smiled slightly. That's what we're betting on anyway. A sailor approached with a message for the captain. Reynolds excused himself, leaving Keiko alone with her thoughts and the endless ocean. She thought about Japan, about the emperor who had demanded total loyalty while his people starved, about the generals who had sent soldiers to die in hopeless battles while calling it honor, about a system that measured human worth by usefulness to the state. Then she thought about Commander Mitchell choosing prisoners over supplies, about Dr. Pearson treating enemy women with the same care as his own sailors, about Mike from Iowa sharing photographs of his children with the daughter of his nation's enemy. The difference was stark, undeniable, devastating. Japan had taught her that strength meant hardness, that compassion was weakness, that the individual meant nothing against the collective good. But here was America, victorious in war, demonstrating that strength could include mercy, that caring for individuals didn't destroy the nation but made it more resilient. Everything she had been taught was backwards. The thought should have made her angry. Instead, she felt a strange relief, like waking up from a nightmare and realizing the monster wasn't real. The fear had been the lie, not the awakening. The USS Maritime docked at San Diego in the early afternoon of the second day. The weather was noticeably warmer than Northern California, sunshine instead of fog, gentle breezes instead of cutting wind. The women gathered their belongings and prepared to disembark, uncertain what awaited them. Camp Pendleton turned out to be a sprawling Marine Corps base south of the city. Their section of the camp was separated from the main base, but not isolated. The buildings were newer than Camp Stockton, made of better materials, with actual insulation and modern plumbing. A Marine colonel named Hendricks greeted them on arrival. He was a large man, probably 6'4", with the bearing of someone who had spent his entire adult life in military service. His voice was gruff, but not unkind. "Welcome to Camp Pendleton," he said through a translator. "I've been informed of your situation. While you're here, you'll be treated as guests under the Geneva Convention. You'll have 3 meals a day, medical care is needed, and recreational time. The weather here is mild, so you won't need the heavy winter gear we're still waiting to receive. You'll be assigned to light work details to maintain structure and routine. Any questions?" The women looked at each other. Guests? Under the Geneva Convention, they were prisoners, but he had called them guests. One of the older women, Tomoko, raised her hand. "Colonel Hendricks, sir. Where will we sleep?" "Barracks 7 through 10 have been prepared for you. 2 women per room. Each room has beds, a small table, chairs, and a private bathroom. Sheets and blankets are already in place." "Private bathrooms? 2 per room?" At Camp Stockton, they had slept 30 to a barracks with shared facilities down the hall. This was better accommodations than most prisoners of any nationality received. Fumiko, still suspicious despite months of evidence to the contrary, asked, "Why are you treating us so well?" Colonel Hendricks looked at her directly. "Because you're human beings under our protection, and this is how we treat people under our protection. Is that unclear?" His tone wasn't hostile, just matter of fact, as if the question itself was strange, as if treating prisoners with basic dignity was so obvious it didn't need explanation. The women were escorted to their new barracks. The buildings were indeed newer, better insulated, with proper heating and lighting. Keiko was assigned a room with Hana. When they opened the door, they found 2 single beds with clean white sheets, a wooden table with 2 chairs, a small dresser, and a bathroom with a shower, toilet, and sink. Hana sat on one of the beds and started laughing. Not happy laughter, something more complicated. Laughter edged with disbelief and sorrow and confusion. "What's funny?" Keiko asked. "This," Hana gestured around the room. "This is nicer than anywhere I ever lived in Japan. I grew up in a farming village with 6 people and 2 rooms. We had an outhouse and bathed once a week in a shared tub. Here I am, a prisoner of war, and I have my own toilet and shower." She looked at Keiko, tears mixing with laughter. "How am I supposed to go home and tell my family that the enemy gave me better living conditions than Japan ever did? How do I explain that?" Keiko had no answer. She sat on her own bed, feeling the mattress, testing the pillows. Everything was clean, functional, almost comfortable. For prisoners, it was luxury. For humans, it was basic decency. That was the difference. Japan had treated its own people as tools. America was treating enemy prisoners as humans. The comparison was damning. The days at Camp Pendleton developed their own rhythm, different from Camp Stockton, but familiar in its routine. Morning wake-up at 6:30, breakfast in a large, well-lit mess hall at 7, pancakes, eggs, bacon, fresh fruit, orange juice, coffee. Work details from 8 to noon, light laundry duty, kitchen help, gardening in the camp's vegetable plots, lunch at 12:30, free time from 1 to 5, dinner at 6, recreational activities until 9, lights out at 10. The work was genuinely light. No one was overworked or exhausted. The Americans seemed more interested in giving the women structure than extracting labor. It was activity for the sake of routine rather than productivity. What struck Keiko most was the level of trust. The women weren't locked in at night. Guards were present but not intrusive. The women could move freely around their section of the camp, could gather in groups, could even access a small library that had been stocked with Japanese books. On the third day, Keiko volunteered to help in the camp hospital. A Marine doctor named Captain Morrison welcomed her, gave her a white coat, and put her to work immediately alongside the American nurses. "You have nursing experience, right?" he asked. "Yes, sir. 3 years in field hospitals." "Good. We're short-staffed this week. I could use someone with trauma experience. There's a training exercise tomorrow that might result in minor injuries, scraped knees, maybe a sprain or two. Help me prepare the treatment room." He handed her a checklist and set her loose. No supervision. No suspicion that she might sabotage supplies or steal medicine. Just trust that a former enemy nurse would do her job competently and ethically. Keiko found herself working alongside a young Navy corpsman named Danny, who couldn't have been more than 22. He chatted while they organized supplies, talking about his fiancée back in Oregon, his plans to become a doctor after his service ended, his opinions on baseball teams Keiko had never heard of. "You ever think about going to medical school?" he asked at one point. Keiko laughed. "Women can't be doctors in Japan." Danny looked genuinely surprised. "Why not?" "It's not proper. Women are nurses, teachers, mothers. Men are doctors, leaders, decision-makers." "That's dumb," Danny said bluntly. "My aunt's a doctor in Portland. Best surgeon in the county. Gender doesn't determine competence." It was said so casually, so matter-of-factly, as if the idea that women couldn't be doctors was obviously absurd. In Japan, such a statement would be radical. Here, it was just common sense. These small interactions, repeated dozens of times with dozens of different Americans, were reshaping the women's understanding of what was possible. They were seeing a society where authority questioned, where women had opportunities, where individual merit mattered more than birth or gender or national origin. It wasn't perfect. America had its own problems, its own prejudices, its own hypocrisies. But compared to the rigid, hierarchical, sacrificial culture of Imperial Japan, it felt like breathing fresh air after years in a sealed room. 2 weeks into their stay at Camp Pendleton, mail arrived from Japan. The letters had been accumulating at Camp Stockton and were forwarded south. The women gathered in the recreation hall as Sergeant Tanaka distributed envelopes. Keiko received 3 letters, one from her mother, one from her younger sister, and one from a cousin in Yokohama. She sat on her bed and opened her mother's letter first. The paper was thin, rationed paper, the handwriting shaky. "My dearest Keiko, winter approaches and we have nothing. Your father's cough has worsened. The medicine is too expensive, and even when we have money, there is none to buy. The radiation sickness affects many in our neighborhood. People die every day. We wrap them in old sheets and burn them because there is no wood for coffins. Your sister has taken work at an American supply depot. She cleans floors for 12 hours a day. They pay her in food. Rice, canned meat, powdered milk. It keeps us alive. She is ashamed to work for the occupiers, but we would starve without it. The Americans are everywhere now, rebuilding, organizing, distributing food. They are not cruel. That is what surprises us most. After all we did, after all we were taught about them, they are not cruel. I do not know what to think anymore. Everything we believed was wrong. The emperor was not divine. The war was not noble. The Americans are not demons. What do we do with such knowledge? How do we rebuild not just our cities, but our understanding of everything? I hope you are well. I hope your captors treat you fairly. I dream of the day we see you again, though I know that day may never come. Your loving mother Keiko read the letter 3 times, then carefully folded it and placed it in her drawer. Around her, other women were reading their own letters, crying quietly or sitting in stunned silence. The letters told similar stories: starvation, sickness, desperation, but they also told stories of American occupation forces distributing food, providing medical care, beginning reconstruction. The conquerors were being unexpectedly merciful. Hana looked up from her own letter, her eyes red. My brother writes that American soldiers gave his school lunch every day, hot soup and bread. The children were afraid at first, but now they run to the trucks when they arrive. He says some of the soldiers taught them English songs. Sachiko was sobbing. My mother says an American doctor saved my father's life. He had an infection and the local clinic had no medicine. An American medical unit treated him for free. She doesn't understand why. She keeps asking why they would save enemy civilians. Tomoko sat very still, her letter in her lap. When someone asked if she was okay, she spoke in a hollow voice. My daughter writes that she wants to marry an American soldier. She says he's kind to her, treats her with respect, wants to take her to America. She asks for my blessing. She looked up, her face a mask of confusion. How do I answer? That? How do I tell her yes or no when I no longer know what's right? The letters created a crisis of consciousness. Here they were, well-fed and comfortable in enemy captivity. Back home, their families were starving, but being saved by those same enemies. Everything was inverted. The people they should trust had failed them. The people they should hate were caring for them. That night, unable to sleep, Keiko walked to the small chapel on the campgrounds. It was non-denominational, open to all faiths. She sat in the back, staring at the simple altar, trying to pray but finding no words. A Marine chaplain found her there around midnight. Father Patrick, an older man with white hair and gentle eyes. "Can't sleep?" he asked. "Can't think," she replied. "Too many thoughts, all contradicting." He sat in the pew beside her, respectful of her space. "Want to talk about it?" And surprisingly, she did. In broken English supplemented with gestures, she told him everything. About the propaganda she'd believed, about the kindness she'd experienced, about the letters from home describing starvation and American mercy, about the fundamental confusion of having your entire worldview shattered and not knowing what to build in its place. Father Patrick listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "I've been a chaplain for 30 years, he finally said. "I've served in 2 wars. I've seen the best and worst of humanity. Here's what I've learned. People are capable of great evil and great good, sometimes simultaneously. Nations are the same. Japan committed atrocities in this war, terrible, inexcusable atrocities. So did America, so did everyone." He turned to look at her. "But that doesn't mean there's no difference between systems of government, between philosophies of human value. Some systems elevate the individual, some crush the individual for the sake of the state. Both can commit evil, but only one creates space for mercy and redemption." "America?" Keiko asked. "Democracy," he corrected. "Rule of law. The belief that rights exist independent of government, that humans have inherent dignity. It's not perfect. We fail at it constantly. But the aspiration matters. The goal of protecting individual worth, even when it's hard, even when it costs us something. Then that aspiration is powerful." He stood to leave, then paused. "You're mourning the loss of certainty. That's natural. But maybe uncertainty is where wisdom begins. Maybe questioning everything you were taught is the first step toward truth." After he left, Keiko sat in the chapel for another hour. She thought about Commander Mitchell sacrificing supplies for prisoners, about Dr. Pearson treating enemies with care, about Mike from Iowa showing pictures of his children to strangers, about American soldiers feeding Japanese children in occupied cities. She thought about the emperor who had demanded loyalty while letting his people starve, about the generals who called retreat strategic withdrawal and called suicide glorious sacrifice, about a government that had valued national pride over human life. The comparison was stark. One side had lost the war but was winning the peace through mercy. The other had demanded everything and given nothing. Keiko couldn't go back to who she had been. That person had believed lies. The question now was who she would become instead. 3 weeks into their stay at Camp Pendleton, a massive winter storm hit Southern California. The weather, unusually severe for the region, brought heavy rain, high winds, and even some snow in the mountains. Temperatures dropped dramatically. The women were safe in their well-insulated barracks, warm and dry. But as the storm intensified, news arrived from Camp Stockton. The aging buildings had suffered damage. 3 barracks had lost their roofs in the wind. The heating system had failed in several buildings. Commander Mitchell and his men were cold, wet, and struggling. Colonel Hendricks called a meeting with the Japanese prisoners. Through Sergeant Tanaka, he explained the situation. "Camp Stockton has sustained storm damage. Our plans to renovate and resupply have been delayed. Commander Mitchell and his men are managing, but conditions are difficult. I want you to know that you will remain here at Pendleton until Stockton is fully repaired and resupplied. Your safety is our priority." The women looked at each other, a collective guilt settling over them. American soldiers were suffering because they had been prioritized. The decision had been the Americans to make, but the consequence felt like their responsibility. That evening, a group led by Keiko approached Colonel Hendricks. She had prepared a statement in English, practiced it with Hana, memorized it carefully. "Colonel Hendricks, sir, we have request. We know the soldiers at Camp Stockton are suffering because of decision to evacuate us. We want to help. We can work, sew, cook, pack supplies, whatever is needed. We can send food from our rations. We can—" Hendricks held up a hand, stopping her. "Miss Keiko, I appreciate the offer. But Commander Mitchell's decision was correct. Your welfare is his responsibility. His men are cold and hungry, yes, but they're not in danger. They're soldiers. They can handle discomfort. You are civilians under our protection. There's a difference." "But we feel responsible," Keiko insisted. "Please, let us help somehow. We cannot accept comfort while they suffer for us." The colonel studied her for a long moment. Finally, he nodded. "I'll tell you what. Some of my men are organizing a supply convoy to take up to Camp Stockton tomorrow. If you want to help pack supplies and write letters of encouragement to send with the convoy, you're welcome to do that. But you're under no obligation." The women worked through the night. They packed boxes of food, blankets, and supplies. They wrote letters, short, heartfelt messages thanking the soldiers at Camp Stockton for their sacrifice. Most of the women's English wasn't good enough for complex thoughts, so they kept it simple. Thank you for your kindness. We hope you stay warm. You are good men. We are grateful. We will remember what you did for us. Thank you. Simple words, but sincere. When the convoy departed the next morning, it carried not just supplies, but also 183 letters from Japanese prisoners to American soldiers. 2 weeks later, responses arrived. The soldiers had written back. One letter, addressed to all the women and read aloud by Sergeant Tanaka, brought the entire barracks to tears. Dear ladies, we got your letters and your care packages. The extra blankets and food were appreciated, but honestly, your letters meant more. It's easy to see enemies as faceless abstractions. It's harder when they thank you for basic decency. We wanted you to know that we don't regret Commander Mitchell's decision. Yeah, we're cold and we're sick of eating canned stew, but we're okay. More importantly, you're okay. That's what matters. That's why we fought this war, not to crush people, but to create a world where even former enemies treat each other with dignity. Some of the guys here lost buddies in the Pacific. They fought against Japan, saw terrible things, came home with scars. But when Mitchell asked if anyone objected to prioritizing your evacuation, not one person spoke against it. Because we're not fighting Japanese people. We fought Japanese militarism. There's a difference. Stay warm down in San Diego. When you come back to Stockton, we'll have the place fixed up nice. Looking forward to seeing you all again. Respectfully, the men of Camp Stockton. The women sat in silence after the letter was read. Fumiko, who had resisted every kindness, who had insisted it was all manipulation, sat with tears streaming down her face. Her defenses had finally crumbled completely. They don't hate us, she whispered. Even after everything. They don't hate us. Sachiko nodded. We were taught that the world operates on revenge, that victory means domination. But they're demonstrating something else. They're showing that strength includes restraint, that power includes mercy. Keiko thought about the letter's phrasing. We're not fighting Japanese people. We fought Japanese militarism. The distinction was crucial. America hadn't waged war against a race or a people, but against a system, an ideology. And having defeated that ideology, they weren't gloating or punishing. They were demonstrating a better alternative. 2 days after the letters arrived, Keiko was working in the hospital when Captain Morrison asked her to assist with a special patient. A Japanese-American soldier, Sergeant Tanaka's younger brother, had been injured in a training accident and needed surgery. During the procedure, Captain Morrison explained each step, teaching her advanced techniques she'd never been allowed to learn in Japan's gender-segregated medical system. After the surgery, while they cleaned up, he asked her a question. Keiko, what are you going to do after you're repatriated? She'd been thinking about that question for weeks. I don't know. Return to my family. Try to survive. Help rebuild. Have you thought about continuing your medical education? You're a natural. You have good instincts. Steady. Hands, and you learn quickly. She shook her head. Women can't be doctors in Japan. What if you stayed here? She looked up, startled. In America? There are programs being established for refugees and displaced persons. You could apply for residency, go to medical school, become a doctor. It won't be easy. There's still prejudice, still barriers, but it's possible in a way it would never be possible in Japan. The offer hung in the air like something fragile and precious. Stay in America. Leave behind everything she'd known, everyone she loved. Embrace a new culture, a new language, a new identity. I can't abandon my family, she said quietly. They need me. Morrison nodded. I understand. But think about it. The war destroyed a lot, but it also created opportunities. You could help your family more as an educated doctor with resources than as an unskilled worker in occupied Japan. That night, Keiko couldn't stop thinking about the conversation. Around her, other women were having similar discussions, wrestling with similar questions. Some, like Fumiko, were determined to return to Japan despite everything. It's still my country, she said. Still my people. I can't abandon them even if the system failed us. Others, like Hana, were considering staying. What do I have to return to? My family's dead. My city is ash. Here I have opportunities. I could learn, grow, build something new. Sachiko was torn. I want to see my parents, but I also want to live in a place that treats me like I have value beyond my ability to serve. Is that selfish? No, Keiko said firmly. It's human. And maybe that's what we're learning, that being human, having individual desires and dreams, isn't selfish. It's our right. The conversation continued late into the night. For the first time, the women weren't debating whether the Americans were sincere. They had accepted that truth. Now they were grappling with what it meant for their futures. Could they go back to Japan and live under the old systems, the old hierarchies, the old lies? Could they unsee what they had seen, unlearn what they had learned? Or would they carry this knowledge home like seeds, planting new ideas in scorched earth, hoping something different might grow. Colonel Hendricks called another meeting in early December. He had news. Ladies, Camp Stockton has been fully repaired and resupplied. The heating systems have been upgraded. The buildings have been renovated. Commander Mitchell has confirmed that conditions are now suitable for your return. Transport will be available in 3 days. He paused, looking around the room at the assembled prisoners. However, I want you to know that you have options. The U.S. government is establishing programs for Japanese nationals who wish to remain in America. If you choose to apply for residency status, assistance will be provided. You're under no obligation to return to Japan if you don't wish to. The room erupted in surprised murmurs. They could choose? They could actually choose? Hendricks continued. This isn't a decision to make lightly. There are implications for your families, your futures, your identities. Take the next 3 days to think carefully. Discuss it with each other, with our counselors, with the chaplain. Whatever you decide, we'll support you. After he left, the women split into smaller groups, debating intensely. Keiko sat with her closest friends, Hana, Sachiko, Yuki, and even Fumiko, whose hostility had softened into resigned acceptance. I'm staying, Hana said immediately. I have nothing in Japan. Here I can go to school, get a job, build a life. Why would I return to rubble and starvation? Because it's home, Fumiko said quietly. Because our families are there. Because we're Japanese and Japan needs us. Japan didn't care about us when it sent us to war, Hana countered. Japan didn't prioritize our lives. Why should I prioritize Japan? Because one is personal and one is principle, Fumiko replied. I'm not staying because I forgive the government. I'm staying because my nieces and nephews are there, and they need someone who learned what we learned here. They need someone who can teach them there's a better way. Sachiko nodded. That's why I'm going back too. Not because I love the system, but because I love the people trapped in it. Maybe we can change things from inside. Can you, though? Yuki asked. Can you really change Japan? Or will the old systems just absorb you, wear you down, force you back into compliance? I don't know, Sachiko admitted, but I have to try. Keiko listened to her friend's debate. She thought about her family, starving in Nagasaki. She thought about Captain Morrison's offer to help her become a doctor. She thought about staying in America versus returning home, opportunity versus obligation, future versus family. That night she made her decision. 3 days later, 157 women boarded transport back to Camp Stockton. 26 had chosen to stay in Southern California, applying for residency status and beginning the long process of building new lives in America. The group was smaller now, changed by separation and choice. Some friendships would continue through letters, others would fade with distance, but all of them carried something new. The knowledge that they had agency, that their choices mattered, that they were individuals with rights rather than tools of the state. The journey north was quieter than the journey south had been. The women had more to think about now, more complicated emotions to process. They were returning to a camp that had been renovated for their comfort, returning to American soldiers who had sacrificed for them, returning to a situation that made no sense according to everything they'd been taught about war and enemies and the natural order of things. When they arrived at Camp Stockton, Commander Mitchell himself greeted them. He looked thinner, tired, but he smiled as the trucks pulled up. Welcome back, ladies. Sorry about the detour, but I think you'll find we've made some improvements. The camp had indeed been transformed. New roofs, upgraded heating systems, insulated walls, even new furniture in the barracks. The Americans had used the 3 weeks not just to survive, but to genuinely improve the facilities for the prisoners' return. That evening, the women organized a thank you dinner. Using ingredients from their rations and working with the camp cooks, they prepared Japanese dishes. Rice balls, miso soup, simple vegetables. It wasn't elaborate, but it was heartfelt. They invited all the soldiers to join them. In the mess hall, American men and Japanese women sat together, sharing food and broken conversation, laughing at the language barriers, communicating through gestures and goodwill. Commander Mitchell stood and raised his cup. Sergeant Tanaka translated as he spoke. I want to thank you all for your cooperation over these past months. When you first arrived, I wasn't sure how this would work. Housing former enemies, treating prisoners as guests, it wasn't what I was trained for. But you've taught me something important. You've reminded me why we fought this war. Not for territory or revenge, but for the principle that every human life has worth. You've helped me and my men become better versions of ourselves. For that, I'm grateful. Keiko stood, her legs shaking, but her voice steady. In careful English, she replied, Commander Mitchell, we are the ones who are grateful. You gave us what our own country never gave. Dignity, choice, care. You treated us like humans when we expected to be treated like enemies. You showed us a better way. Some of us will return to Japan. Some will stay in America. But all of us will carry what we learned here. We will tell our children and grandchildren about the enemy who was not an enemy, about the soldiers who chose mercy over revenge. We will tell them that change is possible, that systems can be better, that humans are capable of great goodness even after great evil. Thank you." The room was silent. Then slowly both the American soldiers and the Japanese women began to applaud, not for victory or defeat, but for the possibility of something better, for the fragile, difficult, necessary work of seeing humanity in those you're supposed to hate. Over the following weeks, the women wrote letters to their families in Japan. These letters were different from the ones before. They were fuller, more honest, more complex. Keiko wrote to her mother, "Dearest mother, I have something difficult to tell you. When I return to Japan, and I will return, I will not be the daughter who left. I have seen things that changed me. The Americans, our enemies, treated us with a kindness I did not know was possible. They sacrificed their own comfort for our safety. They taught me that I have value as an individual, not just as a tool of the nation. I know this is hard to hear. I know it sounds like I have been brainwashed by the enemy. But mother, I have seen both systems now. I have lived under Japanese militarism and American democracy. The difference is undeniable. One system crushed us, the other protected us, even when we were their enemies. When I come home, I want to help rebuild Japan. But I want to help rebuild it differently. I want to build a Japan that values individual life, that treats women as equals, that questions authority, that chooses compassion over cruelty. I know this will be difficult. I know many will oppose it, but I have seen that it is possible. I learned to be a doctor here, mother. The American doctors trained me in skills that would never have been available to me in Japan. When I return, I will use these skills to help our people. But I will also bring new ideas, new hopes, new possibilities. Please don't think I have betrayed Japan. I love our country, I love our people, but I no longer love the system that destroyed us, and I believe with all my heart that we can build something better from the ashes. I will see you soon. I carry you in my heart always. Your daughter, Keiko?" Similar letters were written by dozens of women. Letters explaining their transformation. Letters trying to communicate the impossible, that the enemy had been more humane than their own leaders. Letters attempting to plant seeds of new ideas in scorched and weary soil. Some would be understood. Some would be rejected as propaganda. Some would plant seeds that would take years to grow. But all of them were necessary. All of them were part of the work of rebuilding not just buildings, but beliefs. In February 1946, the women boarded ships for Japan. It was time. The war had been over for 6 months. The occupation was underway. Japan was changing, being reshaped by American influence. It was time for them to go home. Commander Mitchell came to see them off. He shook hands with each woman, wished them well, told them they were always welcome to write. When he reached Keiko, he pressed a book into her hands, a medical textbook. "For your future practice," he said simply. She bowed deeply, tears streaming. "I will never forget what you taught me. Not just medicine, everything." The ship pulled away from the dock. The women stood at the rail, watching America recede. Some cried, some were silent. All were changed. The journey across the Pacific took 3 weeks. When the Japanese coast finally appeared, the women crowded the rails, straining to see home. What they saw was devastation. Burned cities, ruined harbors, a landscape that looked like the end of the world. But among the ruins, they could see movement. People working. Buildings being reconstructed. The early stages of what would become Japan's remarkable post-war recovery. They disembarked at Yokohama. The process was chaotic. Hundreds of people returning from various places, all trying to find transportation to their home cities. American occupation forces were everywhere, organizing, directing, distributing supplies. Keiko watched as American soldiers handed out food to desperate Japanese civilians. She watched them treat people with basic courtesy and efficiency. She watched the same mercy she had experienced being extended to an entire nation. Japan had lost the war, but was being given a chance at redemption. The victors were choosing reconstruction over revenge. It was the same principle that had protected her, the belief that even enemies deserved dignity and opportunity. She found her family in a refugee camp outside Nagasaki. Her mother had aged terribly. Her father was sicker than his letters had suggested. Her little brother was thin but alive. They wept when they saw her. They held her. They asked 1,000 questions, and slowly, over days and weeks, she told them everything. About the soap and the food, about Commander Mitchell's choice, about the soldiers who gave comfort to enemies, about a system that valued individuals, about what she had learned. Her mother listened carefully. Finally, she said, "We have much work to do. Japan must change. We cannot make the same mistakes again." "Will people listen?" Keiko asked. "Some will, some won't, but you will teach them. You and the others who learned these lessons. You will help build a new Japan." And that's exactly what they did. The 183 women who had been prisoners at Camp Stockton and Pendleton scattered across post-war Japan. Most returned to their families. Some settled in new cities. A few, like Hana, remained in America. But all of them carried the same knowledge, the same lessons learned from enemies who had chosen mercy over revenge. Keiko opened a small clinic in Nagasaki in 1948. It was one of the first medical facilities in Japan run by a woman doctor. She faced discrimination, skepticism, and outright hostility from traditional elements. But she persisted, using the skills she'd learned from American doctors, treating patients with the dignity she'd been shown as a prisoner. Her clinic became known for taking patients others turned away: poor people, homeless people, those deemed worthless by a society still recovering from total war. "Every life has value," she would say. "I learned that from my enemies." She trained other women as nurses and advocated for opening medical schools to female students. By the 1960s, Japan began slowly changing its policies. Women doctors were no longer impossible, just rare. By the 1990s, they were common. Sachiko returned to her family in Kyoto and became a teacher. She taught history differently than it had been taught before, emphasizing critical thinking, questioning authority, understanding multiple perspectives. Her students learned that defeat had brought opportunity, that American occupation had demonstrated alternatives to Japanese militarism. Some colleagues called her a traitor. Parents complained. But she continued teaching, and slowly her approach became more accepted. Japan's post-war education system, reformed under American guidance, began emphasizing democracy, individual rights, and peaceful cooperation. Teachers like Sachiko helped make those reforms real. Fumiko, the woman who had resisted most fiercely, returned to Tokyo and worked in reconstruction efforts. She helped rebuild her neighborhood, organized community groups, and became an advocate for women's rights. "Japan told us to sacrifice everything for the nation," she would say in speeches, "but the nation let us starve while the enemy fed us. Maybe we should sacrifice less and demand more." Her activism contributed to the larger women's rights movement in post-war Japan. The new constitution, drafted under American supervision, granted women the right to vote. Over decades, barriers slowly fell. It wasn't quick, it wasn't easy, but it was progress, and it was real. Yuki became a translator for the American occupation forces, then later for Japanese companies doing business with American firms. She married a Japanese man who had also spent time in America and shared her views on democracy and reform. They raised 3 daughters, teaching them that gender didn't limit potential, that authority should be questioned, that individuals had rights. Her daughters became a lawyer, a professor, and a business executive, careers that would have been impossible. In pre-war Japan, they carried forward the lessons their mother had learned as a prisoner of war. And throughout Japan, in hundreds of families, similar stories unfolded. The women who had been prisoners told their stories to their children and grandchildren. They explained what they'd learned about democracy, human rights, dignity, and mercy. They demonstrated through their lives that change was possible, that old systems could be replaced with better ones. Japan's post-war transformation from militaristic empire to peaceful democracy wasn't just the result of American occupation policy. It was also the result of millions of personal transformations. People like Keiko and her fellow prisoners who had learned painful lessons about what their old system had cost them and what a better system might offer. Commander James Mitchell returned to civilian life in 1947. He rarely spoke about his time running POW camps. When asked, he would simply say, "We treated them the way we'd want our own prisoners treated, that's all." But his decision to prioritize 183 Japanese women over supplies for his own soldiers had ripple effects he never fully understood. Those women became teachers, doctors, activists, and mothers. They spread new ideas through Japanese society. They helped create the conditions for Japan's remarkable post-war transformation. In 1985, 40 years after the war ended, a group of surviving women from Camp Stockton and Pendleton organized a reunion. 15 of them were still alive, scattered across Japan and America. They gathered in San Francisco, near where they had first arrived as terrified prisoners expecting death. They visited the sites of the old camps, now repurposed or demolished. They shared stories about their children and grandchildren, about careers and accomplishments, about how Japan had changed. Keiko, now 70 years old and a respected doctor, stood at the Golden Gate Bridge and remembered the frightened young woman who had crossed beneath it 4 decades earlier. "We were told the enemy was evil," she said to the gathered group. "We learned the truth was more complicated. Evil exists, but so does mercy. Systems can crush humanity, but they can also protect it. We learned that individual lives matter, that dignity is not weakness, that compassion is strength." She looked around at her former fellow prisoners, all of them survivors, all of them builders of a new Japan. "We were broken by kindness, Shikintran," she continued, "and from that breaking, something better grew. Not just in us, but in our nation. Japan today is different because we learned these lessons. We learned them in prison camps, from enemies who treated us like humans, and we brought those lessons home." In 2005, at age 90, Keiko gave her final public speech at a university in Tokyo. She told the story of Commander Mitchell's decision, supplies versus safety, comfort versus conscience. She told young students who had never known war what she had learned from experiencing both cruelty and mercy. The measure of a civilization, she said, is not how it treats its own people in times of abundance. It's how it treats its enemies in times of scarcity. By that measure, America in 1945 demonstrated something powerful, that democracy, with all its flaws, creates space for mercy even toward those who fought against you. She paused, looking out at hundreds of young faces, students who took peace for granted, who couldn't imagine a Japan that had valued national pride over human life. You inherited a better Japan than the one I was born into, she told them. You inherited democracy, human rights, and peace. These things weren't gifts from the gods. They were learned, painfully, through defeat and occupation. They were taught to us by enemies who demonstrated a better way. She held up the medical textbook Commander Mitchell had given her 60 years earlier, now worn and faded, but still treasured. This book represents more than medical knowledge. It represents the possibility of change, the possibility that systems can be better, that people can choose compassion, that defeat can lead to growth rather than bitterness. She smiled at the students. Protect what you've inherited, but also question it, improve it, make it better still. That's what we learned. That systems must constantly evolve toward greater justice, greater mercy, greater recognition of human dignity. That work is never finished. Keiko died 6 months later, surrounded by her chosen family of former patients and students. Her funeral was attended by hundreds. Former prisoners came from across Japan. Some sent messages from America. The Japanese government issued a statement recognizing her contributions to medicine and women's rights, but the most meaningful tribute came from her students, who established a medical scholarship in her name for women pursuing careers in healthcare. The scholarship's motto, chosen by Keiko herself, was simple: every life has value. I learned that from my enemies. The story of the 183 Japanese women prisoners at Camp Stockton and Pendleton is not a famous story. It doesn't appear in most history books. There are no monuments, no grand commemorations. But it matters. It matters because it demonstrates something crucial about how humans can choose to treat each other even after terrible conflict. It matters because it shows that mercy is not weakness, that compassion is not naive, that valuing individual dignity is not soft or sentimental, but is in fact the foundation of lasting peace. Commander Mitchell's decision to prioritize enemy prisoners over supplies for his own soldiers wasn't extraordinary by American standards. It was simply following the rules, applying the Geneva Convention, living up to stated values. But for the Japanese women who experienced it, it was revolutionary. It shattered their understanding of how power operates, how enemies interact, how humans can treat each other. And in that shattering, something new could grow. Japan today is a peaceful, prosperous democracy. That transformation happened for many reasons: American occupation policy, economic reforms, war exhaustion, pragmatic leadership. But it also happened because thousands of individuals learned new ways of thinking, new possibilities for organizing society, new understandings of human value. The women of Camp Stockton and Pendleton were among those individuals. They experienced both the worst and best of humanity. They survived a brutal war, surrendered to enemies they feared, and discovered that those enemies would sacrifice their own comfort to ensure prisoner safety. That experience changed them, and they, in turn, helped change Japan. The lesson isn't that America was perfect. It wasn't. The lesson isn't that all enemies are secretly friends. They're not. The lesson is simpler and more profound, that how we treat those at our mercy reveals who we truly are. That mercy itself is a form of power. That the hardest choices, sacrifice, compassion, treating enemies with dignity, are often the right choices. Commander Mitchell probably never knew the full impact of his decision. He died in 1983, having lived a quiet life, having told his story rarely. But the ripples of that decision spread across decades and across an ocean. They touched hundreds of lives directly and millions indirectly. That's how change happens. Not through grand gestures and famous moments, but through individual choices repeated by individual humans who decide, even when it costs them something, to treat others with dignity. The soap that arrived late because prisoners were evacuated first. The meals that were smaller because rations were shared. The cold nights endured because someone else's warmth mattered more. These small sacrifices, multiplied across thousands of interactions, demonstrated a different way of operating in the world. And that demonstration, more than any speech or treaty, convinced former enemies that the system they had fought for was inferior to the system that had defeated them. That's the real victory. Not military conquest, but moral persuasion. Not forcing submission, but inspiring transformation. The women who lived this story are almost all gone now. But their children and grandchildren carry the lessons forward. In clinics and classrooms, in businesses and homes, in the daily choices of how to treat others, the legacy continues. Every life has value. I learned that from my enemies. It's a strange lesson to learn, but once learned, it changes everything. If this story impacted you, please subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. History is full of these hidden moments, times when individuals chose compassion over cruelty, when mercy triumphed over revenge, when enemies became teachers. These stories matter now more than ever. They remind us that change is possible, that humans can be better, that the hardest choices are often the right ones. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that humanity exists even in the darkest times. Leave a comment telling us what you think. What would you have done in Commander Mitchell's position? What would you have done as one of the prisoners? These questions matter. They force us to think about our own values, our own choices, our own capacity for mercy. And if you want to hear more stories like this, true stories from history that challenge our assumptions and inspire better choices, make sure you subscribe. Because these stories are too important to forget and too powerful to ignore. The past has lessons for us. The question is whether we're willing to learn them. Thank you for watching, and remember, how we treat those at our mercy defines who we are.